Good morning. Okay, come on, you can do a little better than that. Good morning. Let's have some energy. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Edna Friedberg, and I am one of the museum's historians. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the spring season of our First Person program. We are in our 16th year of First Person, and our guest today, our honored guest today, is Dr. Alfred Munzer, whom you will meet in just a few moments. The 2016 season of First Person is made possible by the support of a number of generous donors, including the Louis Franklin Smith Foundation and the Helena Rubinstein Foundation, but particularly today the Arlene and Daniel Fisher Foundation, and we're very pleased that Arlene and Daniel are with us today. So if you could just wave. Thank you. We love having this program, and we are grateful. First Person is a series of weekly, or sometimes in the busy season, twice weekly series of conversations with individuals who survived the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer here at the museum, so they are talking not only about what their personal experiences were, but how they came to be connected with this museum and what it means to them to have you line up outside and come to hear about their lives. Our program will continue through mid-August, and if you have friends who are coming to town and would like to see the schedule, please visit our website to find the hours. We also have a podcast series and are posting videos of these programs, so you can look in the coming days and weeks to see if you'd like to share a recording of this program with friends at home. Please look on our website. Additionally, inside your program booklet is a card that says Stay Connected. If you would like to hear about these and other programs that the museum does, including possibly in your community, we do travel around the country with exhibits and public programs such as this one. Please fill out the card and we'd be glad to add you to our e-community. I will ask you if you do that, you will also receive an electronic copy of Al's biography, which will enable you to follow up on some of the details that you will hear today. I ask you to please silence all electronic devices right now. Thank you. A little on our format. Al is going to share his first-person account of his experiences during the Holocaust with us for about 45 minutes, after which we'll be sure to save some time for your questions. So please keep those in mind as we go on. But first, to begin, we've prepared a brief slide presentation to orient you for our conversation today. We begin with this very cute picture of Al Munzer as a little boy, and I want to explain a little bit because it's a particularly appropriate photograph for today of all days. Today is a special day. Tonight in the Jewish calendar marks the Jewish holiday of Purim, on which children dress up in costume. And just by coincidence, we didn't plan this, but when we scheduled Al's talk for today, this photo is a photo of Al dressed for Purim on that day. He is dressed, so in his hand he's holding a charity box, which is to raise money for the Jewish community in Israel. It says the Jewish Fund, Jewish National Fund for Israel, and he is dressed as that box as well. So today he is not, but there he is. This beautiful, beautiful shot is a photograph of Al's parents on their wedding day. Simcha and Giselle Munzer were married in 1932 in The Hague in the Netherlands. And they had 3 children. Al is the baby. Photograph of their 3 kids, beautiful girls, Eva and Leah, and their little brother, Al, in between. Now, for historical context, so you understand the backdrop against which Al's life unfolded, is that of World War II. On this map, you will see the arrows indicating that the German army invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, which, as you will hear, is actually before Al was born. Immediately, life became difficult for Dutch Jews. And these invasion routes show not only the Netherlands, but into France and across Low Countries, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Al survived thanks to the courage and generosity and love of a man that we see here named Tole Madna. Tole Madna was an Indonesian immigrant, and for those of you who are less familiar with the history of Indonesia, it was formerly a Dutch colony. So there was an Indonesian immigrant community in the Netherlands, and that is why you might see a face here, not what you would think of as a typical Dutch rescuer, but we will hear more about that in our conversation. Al spent the rest of the war, the first years of his life, in hiding in Tole Madna's home, where he was cared for by Tole's Indonesian nanny, who is pictured here on the left, a very extraordinary woman named Mima Saina. Al is this squirmy boy on the right in Tole's arms, and we will hear about them soon. After the war, Al came to the United States with his mother in 1958. He learned English, he went to college, he went on to medical school and became a very accomplished pulmonologist. I always embarrass him because he's modest, but he eventually served as president of the American Lung Association. So a man who's devoted his life to service. He remains deeply involved in anti-smoking efforts around the world, working with the WHO, the World Health Organization, to implement an international treaty on the control of tobacco. We at the museum are very fortunate to be the beneficiaries of many of Al's volunteer hours as a speaker, as a translator, giving tours, and he and his spouse, Joel Wind, are cherished members of our community. So with that, I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Al Munzer. Thank you, Al, very much for joining us today.
Delighted to be here.
Let's begin at the beginning, actually before your beginning. Please tell us a little bit about your parents and your family background.
Well, my parents were born in Eastern Europe, a part of the world that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and which after the First World War became part of Poland. My mother was born in a small town called Rymanów, and my father in a neighboring town called Kętrzyga, and they were childhood sweethearts. Now, you know, these are tiny little shtetls, as they're called, but nonetheless, you know, I always like to tell the story that one of the people who came from my mother's little hometown, from Rymanów, was a man by the name of Isidor Rabi. Isidor Rabi came to the United States, became a physicist, and ended up being awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1946 for the discovery of electromagnetism. And so here you have, you know, a very prominent Nobel Prize winner coming from one of those tiny towns. But opportunities in those towns were very limited. And after those towns became part of Poland, after the end of the First World War, there was also a lot of anti-Semitism. And so young Jews typically would leave their homes and seek their fortunes in a larger city. And that big city with a lot of attraction was Berlin. My mother had two older siblings who lived in Berlin, and so she joined them in the 1920s. That's when she came to Berlin before she finally joined my father at the end of 1932 in Holland. My father, on the other hand, came directly from his little hometown to Holland, where he started a men's clothing business in the Netherlands.
And there's a sign still in place, right? Is there not?
Yes, to my great surprise, you know, this was a few years ago. We were walking around the Hague and came to the house where I was born. And there's a, you know, we lived above in an apartment, and my father's business was downstairs, and there was still the sign of my father's business in the portico, a beautiful glass sign. Incredible, you know, shock to see that, a direct connection with my father. Which, of course, I really did not have very much otherwise.
So your parents came to Holland, leaving trying to escape from persecution and being in a tolerant place of opportunity. What did you know from your mother about what life was like for them in Holland during the 1930s?
Well, my parents made many friends in Holland. Most of their friends were not Jewish. Jews had lived in Holland for hundreds of years, were fully integrated into Dutch society, and my parents fit right in. As I said, my father's men's clothing business flourished. He did very well. They had many, many friends. Among their neighbors were two women, one of whom I especially remember. I called her my Aunt Jo, or Tante Jo in Dutch, and she was a very devout Catholic woman. And she would, after the war, when I first met her, she would show me notebooks written by one of my little sisters. And so she was really, this woman was so intimately involved with the lives of my parents that she had actually these notebooks and could tell me stories about my sisters.
So speaking of your sisters, when did your parents start a family?
Well, my oldest sister, Eva, was born in 1936, July 1936. I usually like to explain that, while people were having these very happy circumstances in Holland, trying to live normal lives, just a few hundred miles away, the Nazis really came to full power. So, for example, on the day that my parents, very close to the day that my parents were married, was the day when Adolf Hitler had approached the aging president of Germany, Paul von Hindenburg, and was made Chancellor of Germany, starting the Nazi era. That was just about the same time that my parents were married. And similarly, my sister Eva was born just as the infamous Berlin Olympics were held, which Adolf Hitler, of course, turned into an instrument of Nazi propaganda. So you have the juxtaposition of a very happy family event, and then just a few hundred miles away, the rise really of the Nazi era. And then 2 years later, in November 1938, is when my parents celebrated the birth of their second child. And that was my sister Leah. And that too corresponded to a horrible event in Germany, because my sister Leah was born just 2 days after what is commonly called the Night of Broken Glass, Kristallnacht. And it's the night when the full fury of anti-Semitism was unleashed in Germany, and hundreds of synagogues were ransacked and destroyed, and thousands of Jewish businesses were plundered. So again, a very happy occasion in Holland. And while my parents, of course, must have been worrying about the same time about the relatives they had left behind, especially in the case of my mother, her older brother and older sister, who were still living in Berlin at the time. But my parents celebrating this happy occasion of their second child.
September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, sparking World War II. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the following spring, the Netherlands is invaded. What can you tell us about what this meant for your family and other Jews?
Well, my mother has described the events of what happened of the invasion to me. And on the night of May 10th, 1940, my parents had been asked to shelter a man who was a member of the Dutch resistance movement. And he supposedly carried a briefcase, my mother told me, which contained plans to preemptively destroy the railroad center in the city of Utrecht. And the Dutch resistance felt that if they could destroy that railroad center, it would slow down the German invasion. But that morning, my parents and their guest listened to the radio and heard that the port city of Rotterdam had been destroyed, had been bombed and destroyed. And a few minutes later, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands came on the radio and announced basically that Holland had surrendered. And she called on Dutch citizens to do their duty wherever they happened to find themselves. And my mother told me that the first person to speak up was the man who was a member of the Dutch resistance movement. And he said in Dutch, "Goddank, het is ten einde." Thank God, it's over. As far as he was concerned, he would just have to accommodate to living under the occupation. But he could be satisfied that he had tried to do what he could to start or stop the German invasion. But for my parents, as they looked at their two little children in a playpen at the time, they realized that they were going to be all alone, and they knew what had happened to their relatives in Germany and in Poland especially, and they knew they were going to be all alone, and that things were going to change very rapidly. And indeed, in very, very short order, all of the restrictions that had been put in place on Jews in Germany were put in place in Holland. The first thing that happened, my mother told me, was a ban on the ritual slaughter of animals and for kosher meat. And it's something that some people might feel, well, it's a pretty benign thing, nothing very serious. Maybe some people would even view it as, quote, humane. But that was just the first step of isolating the Jews. The next things was that Jews had to take on a new middle name. Men, the middle name Israel; women, the middle name Sarah. They had to register their property to make confiscation ultimately, much easier. And they had to register, of course, as Jews. And the other regulations that were put in place were much more restrictive to their personal lives. Jews were prohibited from using public transportation, my mother told me, and they were prohibited from going into public parks. And that led to a particular incident with my mother, actually. She, when you have a regulation, it doesn't make much sense, like being prohibited from going into your neighborhood park. You ignore it. And so my mother ignored the regulation, and she took my little sister, Leah, in her baby carriage to the park, a neighborhood park. And one day, a German woman approached the baby carriage. And my mother's heart, she told me, almost stopped. And then the woman looked at the baby, my little sister, with blonde curls and blue eyes, and she turned to my mother and she said, "Ah, you can tell that this is good Aryan German stock." And my mother, of course, had a sigh of relief, thanked the woman, and never went back into that park again.
Now, in fact, your parents actually enrolled your sister in a Catholic school, did they not?
Yes, and I'm not entirely clear what the time frame was, but I do have photographs of my sisters being enrolled in a Catholic school to hide their Jewish identity. I'm not sure whether that happened before my sisters were placed into hiding or afterwards, but it certainly was an attempt to hide their Jewish identity.
Early in 1941, your parents realized something surprising, that your mother was pregnant with you.
That's right.
Tell us what your mother told you about that time.
Yeah, early in 1941, as the family tried to go on with their normal lives, my mother found out that she was pregnant again. And she consulted her obstetrician, and he told her in no uncertain terms that she had to have an abortion. He told her that it would be immoral to bring another Jewish life into the world. Now, my mother wasn't particularly religious at the time, but she turned to the Bible for advice. And my mother told me that she read the story of Hannah. And Hannah, you might recall, was a woman who was desperate to conceive and would go to the temple every year and pray that she might have a child. And she made this pledge: if God will give me a child, I will give that child to the service of God all of the days of his or her life. And it was in reading of Hannah's desperate desire to have a child that my mother decided that she could not possibly have an abortion. Her obstetrician fired her as a patient, and so November 23rd, 1941, I was born at home with the help of a nurse.
And in addition to the profound leap of faith and the fears your parents must have had to bring a new Jewish life into the world in that time and place, 8 days later they did something else extraordinary.
Yes, because traditionally little Jewish boys are circumcised in a ceremony called a bris, or brit milah, when they are 8 days old. And my parents' friends advised them very strongly. They said, well, don't have him circumcised. It will identify him as being Jewish. But this time the answer to my parents' dilemma came in the form of the worried look on the face of a pediatrician who had just examined me. And my father turned to the pediatrician and he asked him, he said, is there anything wrong with the baby? And the pediatrician said, no. He said, it's nothing serious. It's just that your baby needs a minor operation that we call a circumcision. And so my parents told the pediatrician of our Jewish tradition, and 8 days later, our family gathered probably for one of the very last such ceremonies in Holland, really the first milestone in the Jewish life for the bris ceremony. And they had like any other family, they had photographs taken at the ceremony. They were very small photographs, actually. At least those are the only ones I've seen. And it shows, the whole family gathered in the living room. And then a second picture with me on a pillow. And what's special about those photographs is that they were only about 1 by 1.5 inch in size. And my mother was to keep those 2 little photographs hidden on her body through her subsequent stay in 12 concentration camps. She developed this feeling, this superstition, that if she ever lost those photographs, it would mean that I had been killed. Fortunately, my mother survived, the photographs survived, and of course I survived. And those photographs, of course, are so fragile, so valuable, that I did not want to keep them in the house. And that's why I entrusted them to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and they are now part of the story of this museum.
Thank you. And it is a sacred duty for us to care for them, so thank you. So over the first 10 months of your life, things became increasingly dangerous for Jews in the Netherlands. They were forced to wear yellow stars, riskier and riskier every day, and your parents eventually became convinced that they needed to go into hiding. Tell us a little bit about how they arranged to do that.
Well, many of you may be familiar with the famous story of Anne Frank, another Dutch family, Dutch Jewish family, that went into hiding. And of course, they went into hiding as one unit. But my parents decided, like many other families, that as a form of insurance, so that if one person was taken in the family and was killed, at least the others might survive, that we ought to split up. So the first to go into hiding was my father. He had received a notice to report for labor duty in a camp in Holland. And he knew that meant eventually being sent to a camp much further east, as they were called at the time. And so he was the first one to go into hiding, pretending to commit an act of suicide, which gained him admission to a psychiatric hospital called the Remarkliniek. And then my mother, through the intervention of that same aunt, Tante Jo, our neighbor, Aunt Jo, was, as I said, a very devout Catholic woman. And she put my mother in touch with two priests, Father Cummings and Father Ludders. And they in turn told her about a woman who had had a dream in which she saw the Virgin telling her to take Jewish children into hiding. And so my two sisters, Eva and Leah, were placed with that woman, with that very devout Catholic woman. And that's when they really assumed, their Catholic identity, even though they may have attended a Catholic school before. And then that left my mother alone with me, in our home. And my mother described being extremely frightened, being alone in our house. She was afraid of the doorbell ringing because she thought that might be one of the German soldiers coming to the home. So she dampened the clapper of the doorbell. And then, of course, she spent the whole night watching the clapper because it wasn't making any noise, to see if it was moving. So this is just the incredible tension that she felt being left alone in the house. Jewish boy children were more difficult to place, but finally a neighbor of my mother, a woman by the name of Annie Madna, agreed to take me in. And so my mother took me to Annie, who lived right across the street from us. But Annie had had some run-ins with the Nazis herself, so she first passed me on to her sister. And then it turned out that the sister had a neighbor who was a member of the Dutch Nazi Party, and she was afraid that he might hear a baby crying. And so she returned me to Annie Madna. And then finally Annie Madna passed me on to her ex-husband. She had been married to an Indonesian man, Tole Madna. They were divorced, and she passed me on to her ex-husband. And that's how I came to be with Tole Madna. And then at that point, my mother joined my father in the same psychiatric hospital where he was hiding, in her case, pretending to be a nurse. And so I was adopted for all practical purposes by Tole Madna, and especially by the nanny who had taken care of the 3 Madna children earlier. Her name was Mima Saina. She was an Indonesian woman, completely illiterate, spoke no Dutch, couldn't read or write, only spoke the Indonesian language, had come to the Netherlands to do work in a restaurant, which Papa Madna, as I used to call him, Tole Madna, was the manager of, and eventually she became the nanny for his children. But this woman, who was illiterate, had a heart of gold, and she would literally walk miles every day just to get milk for me. I was in the home completely illegally, and everything was very, very strictly rationed. So you had to have coupons for any kind of food that you wanted. And so if you wanted milk for a baby, you had to have coupons. And since I was in the home illegally, there were no coupons. And so she had to scrounge around even to get milk for me. Actually, a few years ago, I was in Holland, and a woman approached me and said, "You know, you used to drink my milk." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well," she said, "all school children in Holland were given a little bottle of milk every day. And my mother told me to save half that little bottle for the baby next door. And you were the baby next door." So here you have it, 6-year-old child participating in saving another life.
Al, sorry, if I can interrupt for just 1 second. Your sisters were not physically hidden, though, because I want to make sure that the visitors understand that you could be hidden in the open and you could be visually, literally hidden.
Yes, they were hidden quite in the open, actually, as Catholic children attending, Catholic school. In my case, I was not allowed out of the house at all. There were only 2 little kids who were allowed to come into the house and play with me. They were neighbors' kids, and the reason they were trusted is that they were Germans, but they were communists. They were German communists, and so they were very anti-Nazi, and so they were thoroughly trusted to come into the house and play with me. I'm told that I slept in Mima's bed, and she kept a knife under her pillow, I'm told, vowing to kill any Nazi who might try to come and get me. Or even, she said, kill me rather than have me fall in their hands. An amazing, amazing woman.
When you describe the communist neighbors, the little girl next door, it's just a reminder of how tenuous the situation was for you and for children like you, how it took networks of trust. And I would invite you, if you have time today, down the hall on this level, we have a special exhibition called Some Were Neighbors, about collaboration and complicity in the Holocaust. And it's exactly about that, about the connections between friends, between coworkers, teachers and students, all the personal relationships that could allow a small baby or an adult to survive. Al, as a parent, it's hard for me to imagine the trust that your parents had to have in what were essentially strangers. What contact, if any, did they have with you, with your sisters, with their rescuers? What did they know?
Well, my parents knew the Madna family quite well. They all lived in the same neighborhood. Papa Madna, after the war, always prided himself that he had a suit that came from my father, was made by my father, actually, in his workshop. So, there was a really good connection, and they were really trusted. My parents did not know the woman who had agreed to take in my sisters very well. And that has ended up being a major problem. Because about a year later or so, after my sisters were in hiding, the husband denounced his wife as hiding 2 Jewish children.
So he turned her in.
And so his wife was taken prisoner, along with my 2 sisters. His wife eventually was freed, but my sisters, who were then 6 and 8 years old, were taken to a prison, first in Scheveningen, near Holland, a building my mother could never stand to look at again. It was a real problem for her after the war, because she knew that's where my 2 sisters had been taken. They were then taken to a Dutch concentration camp, Westerbork, and then almost immediately shipped to Auschwitz, where they were killed. February 11th, 1944. They were 6 and 8 years old at the time. So there you have the 2 completely divergent stories. The memories that I have of being with the Madna family, there aren't too many memories. I was much too little. I was 9 months old when I had been left with them. And so I have very few memories, but they are fun ones. They're happy ones. I remember Papa Madna, playing at the piano. I remember, Mima singing lullabies to me. I remember, one time getting very angry, actually, at my 2 foster sisters, Davy and Villy. They were doing their homework and writing, and so I, as a little kid, like any other kid, tried to imitate them. And I took a pen and started scribbling, and they all broke out in laughter because obviously the scribblings made no sense. And I got very, very angry because they were laughing at me. It's one of those few memories that I have. Now, there were other memories. I remember, for example, having to go into hiding into a small cellar. But even that was a happy memory because the one thing that stands out was playing with all the Christmas decorations that were hiding there. And that's the thing that stands out. So my memories, of those years were very, very happy ones. Now, my parents, interestingly enough, were allowed one more visit with my sisters before my parents were also deported. And that was for Christmas Day, 1942. That's when my two sisters were taken to the psychiatric hospital where both my parents at that point were hiding. My mother, the nurse, my father as a patient. And that was a mini reunion of the family then. But 3 days later, the psychiatric hospital was emptied of all patients and staff, and they were all deported and taken to a concentration camp.
So they could not know that would be the last time they would see their girls.
No. There was still that hope that eventually there might be peace. And, after my parents were taken to the same concentration camp that I mentioned earlier, Westerbork, then to another concentration camp on Dutch soil called Vught, where they both did slave labor for the Philips Electronics company. And my mother described being, in that concentration camp where there would be a morning lineup every day at about 5 or 6 a.m. And she said one day Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's second in command, came to visit the camp, and he gave a big speech, and he exhorted all the prisoners to keep working for the success of the German Reich, and that as long as they kept working, nothing bad would ever happen to them. And my mother told me that way in the distance, while he was speaking, she saw the spire of a small Dutch church. And she said it would be so wonderful if peace were to come at that moment, and she could run to that church and fall on her knees and thank God for being freed. It didn't matter to her whether it was a church, a synagogue, or a mosque, just a place, to thank God for being freed. Of course, Heinrich Himmler lied, and 3 months later, the concentration camp in Vught was emptied of all prisoners, and they were all sent to Auschwitz. And that's where my parents were separated.
You've described your time in the Madna household to me as life through the mail slot. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Yes, as I said, I wasn't allowed out of the house at all. And the only view that I had of the outside world was what I could see through a mail slot. And there were some people who were really neighbors of my parents who were very anxious to see how I was doing. And they were not allowed into the house either, but they too could look into the house through the mail slot to see that I was around. And that's really the limit of my outside view.
For years.
For years. The first 4 years of my life.
You've said that not many of the Dutch neighbors knew you were there, but many in the Indonesian community did. Now, given that this was a period of time when Jews were being actively hunted by Germans, what story did the Madna family come up with to explain the presence of a white toddler in their Indonesian household had you been seen?
They had 3 children who really looked very, very different, but who did adopt me as their little brother. Actually, there was a vote in the family to keep me there. That's something I found out fairly recently. The plan initially was for me to be shipped to a family in some of the Dutch farmlands where most Jewish children were hidden. But the Matna children were so fond of me that they wouldn't part with me. And that's how I ended up spending the years with them.
At great risk to their
At
family.
absolutely, at a tremendous risk to the family.
You've said by the winter of 1944-45, so you're a little older, you have some clearer memories, that winter was particularly hard and bitter. Can you tell us a little about what you recall?
What I remember was being hungry. There was very, very little food in Holland during that last winter. And what I remember is one day seeing the table set for breakfast. And I got up from my bed, walked over to the table, hoping that I was about to be fed. And I remember falling asleep with my head falling on the plate, and one of my foster sisters coming to get me there and finding me there. That's one of those other memories of being with the Madna family.
That winter, a lot of the Dutch population survived by eating tulip bulbs.
That's correct, yes. Now, you asked me about the stories that Papa Madna would come up with to explain my presence in the household, because the house was being searched, had been searched several times. And he told some of the German soldiers that I was the illegitimate child of his ex-wife, and that she now had a new boyfriend who did not want me around. And that's why she had passed me on to him. That was one of the many stories he concocted. I'm told that another time, the family decided that it should be Mima answering the door. And because she spoke no Dutch, no German, there was total miscommunication between her and the soldier who came to the door. And so he gave up and just, walked away. Papa Madna was a man who was fabulous at making up stories. And, he could tell a story like the one I told you, just with a straight face, and be very, very believable.
You're running short on time, but there are several more things I'd like to cover. Tell us briefly what happened to your parents after they were incarcerated.
Well, my mother, both my parents, as I said, ended up in Auschwitz, and that's where they were separated. My mother was sent on to work, do slave labor in another electronics factory, Telefunken, in a concentration camp called Reichenbach. And my mother described witnessing that camp being bombed by the Allies and saying a prayer of thanks to God in Hebrew, the Shechayanu prayer, as she saw that factory going up in flames. But that was not the end of her ordeal, because the Germans then evacuated all the prisoners and moved them further west on what were called death marches, and many people indeed succumbed, but eventually my mother was freed at the Danish border. My father's story was different. He remained in Auschwitz for about 6 months, and then went on to another concentration camp in Austria called Mauthausen, a real hellhole of a camp. And if you visit the exhibit upstairs, you'll see an exhibit of these huge boulders that the prisoners were forced to carry in that camp, where they would very often be tripped, and many of them lost their lives that way. Then my father went on from Mauthausen to 3 more camps, Gusen, Steyr, and finally a camp called Ebensee. Ebensee is located high in the Austrian Alps, a beautiful spot where The Sound of Music was actually filmed. And my father worked in abandoned salt mines, assembling V2 rockets. Horrible, horrible work. And he did see liberation. He was liberated by the U.S. Army, but he was so weakened that he passed away 2 months later, still in Ebensee, and he lies buried in the concentration camp of Ebensee. And I visited, his grave, which was an amazing experience. It's the it's the first time, the only time when I fully came to grips with the loss of my father. And I broke out in tears as I stood at his grave. An incredible experience. Something similar happened when I visited Mauthausen, and there was a monument put up by the Dutch government, and there I found, totally to my surprise, my father's name, and again, same reaction. It really suddenly hit me, that I had lost my father, that I never had a chance to know my father.
Just last year, you learned additional details about your father through documents in this building, right?
That's right. Yeah, every day little documents still appear. So I came across a little slip of paper of when my father was in Auschwitz, and it had his number as a prisoner, and then in German it said premium employee, no name, just the number, and then a signature, premium employee. And so I asked the researcher what that meant, and the researcher told me that it meant that the Germans, the factories had to pay the wages of the slave labor they employed to the SS, to the Nazis, and it meant that your father was considered a premium employee, and they had to pay higher wages to the SS. Just an amazing example of the tremendous bureaucracy that was set up to basically to kill people.
That story is just one example of what we are constantly, daily discovering. It's easy to think about the Holocaust as an exhaustively researched topic, but every day we find new things. We expect the size of our collection to double in the next 10 years. Double, that's kind of mind-boggling, a little intimidating to historians, but each of them is a story like your father. Tell us about your mother's liberation.
My mother was liberated through the intervention of a man, of Count Volk Bernadotte, who was the head of the Swedish Red Cross. He had negotiated the freedom of several thousand women. And my mother described coming off these cattle cars and onto Danish soil and being greeted by Count Bernadotte. And she says she and her fellow prisoners were so ashamed of their appearance, but Bernadotte insisted on embracing every single one of the prisoners as they came off the train. And then she was sent to recuperate in Sweden. And she remained in Sweden for about 3 months. And then in August 1945 is when I was reunited with my mother. And that's the first really clear memory that I have. I remember being asleep in one of the back rooms, and my sister Devi coming to wake me.
Your foster sister.
My foster sister, Devi, right. I still call her my sister
That's
now.
fine, just
she's still alive.
for clarity.
That's how we, exactly. But she carried me into the living room. I was cranky and crying, and the whole family was gathered in the living room, sitting in a circle. And she passed me from lap to lap, like you do with a kid who's crying. And I remember that there was one lap I wouldn't sit in, one woman I pushed away, and that was my own mother, because she was a total stranger to me, and I already had a mother, and that was Mima Saina. My mother realized that it would be very difficult to separate me from Mima, and so her plan was for Mima to continue to care for me while my mother went out looking for work. But sadly, 2 months later, in October 1945, Mima had a cerebral hemorrhage and passed away. And so I have very, very few memories, actually, of Mima. A few words of the Indonesian language, which was my native tongue. That's how she spoke to me. And I remember visiting her grave because Papa Manda took me there so many times. But other than that, I have really no direct memories of Mima at all.
You did describe Mima singing lullabies to you. Can you tell us about a more recent Indonesian lullaby?
One of the amazing experiences that I've had, through the museum was about 2 years ago, is meeting up with a group of Indonesian students visiting the United States, a group of about 30 students. And I told them the story with photographs of Mima holding me, Mima in very traditional Indonesian dress. And then at the very end of the story, I told them, I said, Mima used to sing a lullaby to me, and it was called Nina Bobo. And all 30 students started singing the lullaby in unison. An amazing, amazingly moving experience for me. And after that, young men and women, young women with headscarves, traditional, Indonesia is now the largest Muslim country in the world. These young women in headscarves coming up to me, hugging me and kissing me and saying, "We are all one family." An amazingly, powerful message. And it shows, that the message that we convey in the museum and my personal story has still a tremendous impact.
And Al has gone to Indonesia, and the museum does work in Bahasa, the language of Indonesia, and Al is a close partner in that work. I'll ask you just two more things before we open it to the audience. Tell us about an incident at the movies, though, that happened to you and your mother, when you and your mother were in Holland not long after the war ended,
yes.
and you went to see a movie.
Yeah, we often think that, the end of the Holocaust was the end of anti-Semitism.
Of hatred of Jews.
Yeah, but my mother and I were standing in line, to go to a movie. This must have been 1946 sometime, and there was a man standing behind us, and he saw my mother's tattoo from Auschwitz, and he said in Dutch, "There is one they didn't get." And after that, of course, my mother always wore 3/4 length sleeves. She did not want anyone to see the number that she had. But it sadly shows, that anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, did not end, with the Holocaust. Neither did it end hatred at all. The saddest part of the story of the Holocaust, as far as I'm concerned, is that it did not spell an end to hatred. That hatred and genocide, continue to this day.
I think on that note, we should open it for questions. We have runners with microphones because we want to be sure that everyone can hear. So please raise your hand and I will get a microphone to you. First this woman and then this young man. Yeah, there.
My English is not very good. I come from Germany. And I would like to know where your father went to Den Haag, and why your mother emigrated to the United States. Was it anti-Semitism still even now active in whole Europe? I'm sorry for this.
Sure.
Did people hear the question? Shall I repeat?
Sure.
I'll repeat.
Did you understand?
Yes,
I'm sorry, my English
it's
is not very good.
Even for an American accent, I always repeat. So the question is about why your father, why Al's father first immigrated to the Netherlands, and then why you and your mother left the Netherlands. Was it because of anti-Semitism, discrimination against Jews?
So my father left his hometown, Kansuga, for the Netherlands, basically for two reasons. One, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And then the second was, in Poland, there were very few opportunities. And so he decided, to build a new life in a country that had a much more liberal atmosphere, and that was Holland. That's how he came to Holland. And that's the same motivation that my mother had in coming to Berlin in the 1920s. And then, second?
About why you left Holland,
Why
you
we
come
left
to the
Holland,
U.S.
yes. I think my mother just really wanted to get away from all of the memories of the Second World War, of the Holocaust. After we came to the United States, she never went back to Holland. She traveled a lot, really tried to start life all over again, and was very successful at that, I think. But there were certain things that she did not want to go back to, and one of them was going back to Holland. She never did. By the same token, my mother never had a strong anti-German feeling. She always, and she impressed this on me, that we judge people as individuals and never as part of a group.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. You started to touch upon my question with the movie theater story, and I know there's no brief answer to this, but as briefly as you can, I was hoping you could elaborate a little further on life after the war, in between the time of, August 1945 and when you emigrated to the United States.
It's a very good question, actually. I grew up with the Holocaust in those immediate post-war years. So I heard talk all around me of people who had not come back, that's the expression that was used, and others who did come back, like my mother. And somehow, my sisters did not come back. I didn't know what had happened to them. Aunt Jo, as I told you, used to tell stories about my sisters and how wonderful they were. My mother told me stories like that. And as a child, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, I was actually slightly jealous of my 2 sisters. I did not understand what had happened to them. And, many of my classmates had lost brothers and sisters. Many of them had lost both parents. So I grew up really with the Holocaust, and it took many years for me to really understand what that meant. And I guess I gained that knowledge very, very gradually. But I thought, playing in a city that had been reduced to rubble was the most normal thing. Playing on the beach, hiding in bunkers, I thought that's what kids do. Sadly, kids still do that in war zones today.
Other questions? Yes, here, the woman in green.
There were pictures that were shown of your sisters and your parents getting married. How did you get those photographs after the war?
How did I get the photographs after the war? Fortunately, in Holland there were some good people, and there were people who kept many of my parents' possessions, including that very prized possession of boxes of photographs. And I have, gone through those photographs, and that's, I sat down with my mother, went through the photographs, and that's how I have been able to tell, the story of my family.
It's our tradition here that our first person guest has the last word. So Al, if there are any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us.
I think the one message that I'd like to leave is that, yes, the story of the Holocaust obviously is a horrible story. It's a terrible event. But the message I'd like to leave you with, that there were people in this huge sea of terror, of horrible events, of hatred. There were a few people who were willing to stand up and do the right thing, like the Madna family. And I would hope that, and this is the thing that I leave children with when I talk to classrooms, I said, whenever you hear people using the word hate, remember where that can lead, that can lead to people ultimately being killed. And let's do everything we possibly can to imitate the Madna family and stand up even in a sea of hate.
Al, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.